Thank you to NOLA Mattress for the sponsorship. More about them later in the video. Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, cosmic horror author Eric Malachite, and today's script was provided by Radu Alexander. So be sure to show him some love in the comments as you deploy your like, subscribe, and ring that bell, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical figures. Let's get to it. During the 13th century, an unrelenting and unstoppable force swept through Asia and then Europe. It was the Mongol horde under the leadership of the fearsome Genghis Khan, or Genghis Khan if you feel like being more accurate. As one of the mightiest conquerors in history, Genghis Khan created an empire the size of which the world had never seen or even thought possible. But Genghis Khan died in 1227, decades before his kingdom reached the peak of its power. It was up to his descendants to continue his conquering ways and ensure the glory of the Mongol Empire. And first up was his son and heir, Ögedei. Ogadeay, also spelled Ögedei, Ogadeay, and a few other variations, was born circa 1186 AD, somewhere in the Kamag Mongol Uls, which was the mysterious tribal confederation that lived on the Mongolian plateau and preceded the Mongol Empire. We're gonna have to keep it vague here, since as a nomadic people, the Mongols are not exactly a fountain of knowledge. It would be wrong to say that they did not keep any records. However, it is true that they did not keep a lot of records, and that most of the stuff we know about them comes from secondary sources, usually in the form of other cultures that had the misfortune of encountering the Mongol juggernaut. To say that Ögedei lived in his daddy's shadow would be the understatement of the century. After all, his father was none other than Genghis Khan, one of history's most prodigious and ruthless conquerors. Few names inspire more fear and dread throughout the world during the 13th century than that of Genghis Khan, especially if you heard that he was coming your way. As the founder and first Khagan, or emperor of the Mongol Empire, Genghis Khan took the Mongols from a bunch of tribes in the steppes of Central Asia and unleashed a wave of destruction upon the world, the likes of which it had never seen, on the way towards creating the largest contiguous land empire in history, second only to the British Empire. Obviously, when that is the kind of family legacy you have to live up to, you have your work seriously cut out for you. Of course, being the son of the Khagan did have its benefits. When he came of age, Ögedei was given a large swath of land, a vast army, and the best tutoring in the ways of war. He knew that it would not be long before he would have to prove his worth in battle, just like his older brothers. For Ögedei, that time came around 1211 AD, when he was in his mid-20s. His father was still fighting with the Qin and Western Xia dynasties in China. Clearly, whatever Ögedei did was enough to impress the old man, though, because when it came time to designate an heir, Genghis chose him, despite the fact that Ögedei was the third of four sons that the Mongol leader had with his Khatun, or queen consort, Perthe. Genghis died of uncertain causes in 1227 AD while campaigning in Western Xia. Although he had expressed his desire for Ögedei to succeed him as the Great Khan, something like this was not done lightly, and the official procedure had to take place at a great council known as a Kurultai. Now, if you don't want to sleep like the Mongols who slept on beds made of leather and dried corn, then you're going to need an extra comfy mattress, and that's where today's sponsor, NOLA Mattress, comes in. I tend to like having a softer mattress when I need to relax, and I also snore, so sometimes it's more than necessary to lay down in another room while wife gets her beauty sleep. We selected a full-size mattress for our guest room, and the model NOLA Mattress sent us is absolutely perfect. We had a long night the day before the mattress was delivered, and let me tell you, I wanted to pass out the moment my body hit that mattress. Best of all, though, is that NOLA Mattress delivers it right to your door with free shipping on orders made in the US. It literally took 5 minutes to unbox and inflate the mattress and pillows before we were able to take it for a test drive, i.e. nap time.
I don't know, this is just how it ended up being. Do not question the director. No.
Alright, so, we have just now laid down on the mattress, and it is super comfy.
You can make the bed around me, right?
Yeah, totally. You're just gonna nap?
Yeah. Alright, I think we're gonna keep it.
The mattress is super soft and the pillows are incredibly comfy as well. We've had the mattress about a month now and we've got no complaints. NOLA Mattress also has a 120-night sleep trial that allows you to test your mattress out to make sure it's the right fit for you. I love NOLA Mattress, and I think you will too. If you're looking to upgrade your sleep, head to nolamattress.com/biographics and use code biographics to get an extra $50 off your NOLA mattress, plus 2 free pillows with select mattresses. This is an additional discount on top of what is being offered on site, so check them out while you can. Gathering everyone in the same room together took some time, which was why Ögedei did not actually become the new Khagan until 2 years later. In the meantime, his youngest brother Tuthlui served as regent, although he mainly filled the role of a civil administrator and was never considered a Khagan himself. When it came time for the Kurultai, Ögedei was elected as the new Great Khan without too much fuss. Only 4 men could have claimed to succeed Genghis. Ögedei's oldest brother Jochi had already died around the same time as Genghis, and the 2 remaining ones, Chagatai and Tuthlui, were both willing to fulfill their father's wishes. Therefore, in 1229, Ögedei Khan assumed command of the most vicious and relentless army known to man, and with it he intended to do the same thing his father did every night.
Try to take over the world.
When Genghis Khan died, he was in the middle of a prolonged and extremely bloody conflict with the Qin Dynasty in North China, so unsurprisingly, Ögedei continued his father's war when he became Great Khan. He launched new offenses against the Chinese, trying to capture their new capital, which the Qin Emperor had relocated to Kaifeng. However, none of these initial skirmishes went his way. Actually, his forces suffered one of their most lopsided defeats ever at the Battle of Da Cheng Yuan in 1229, where 400 Chinese cavalrymen led by a monk named Wan Yan Chen bested a Mongol army of 8,000 soldiers. In fact, Chen was so impressive in his efforts that his later death at the Battle of Sanfeng Mountain prompted a show of respect from the Mongol generals, who hoped that one day he would be reincarnated on their side. His foot was broken, but he didn't surrender. His mouth was cut up to the ear. He bled but shouted. Until death he didn't yield. The great generals discussed the matter, then poured wine and mare's milk on the ground for ritual, and celebrated him, saying, "Great man, when you are born another day, you must come to us." Despite the initial setbacks, Ögedei persevered, and after a few years of fighting, the tide turned in his favor. He received help from the Song Dynasty, who were enemies of the Qin state, and saw this war as the perfect opportunity to settle some old scores and regain some of the territories that they had previously ceded to their neighbors to the north. With their assistance, Ögedei reached the Qin capital of Kaifeng in 1232 and laid siege to it. He then left the battlefield to dedicate his attention to other affairs, placing the fate of the military campaign in the extremely capable hands of his general Subutai. Like his father, Ögedei fought on several fronts at once, trusting his highest-ranking generals to handle matters when he was not there. In fact, from here on, he mainly adopted a hands-off approach to his military campaigns. Everyone, including Ögedei himself, knew that he wasn't the sharpest military mind in the world. Genghis likely chose him as his heir because he possessed good leadership qualities like intelligence, charisma, and composure, not because he was the second coming of Alexander the Great. That's what generals were for. He communicated with them through an innovative system called the Yam, a network of relay stations throughout the empire that allowed messengers to travel for days on end, stopping along the way for supplies and fresh horses before passing the message on to a rested rider, which sounds an awful lot like the postal system when it first started here in the US, doesn't it? So the Mongols had a postal system. The Mongols were famed for their riding prowess, and it was said that they could do everything on horseback, including eating, going to the bathroom, and even sleeping. The system wasn't completely original, though. The Achaemenid Empire did something similar over 1,500 years earlier, but it was incredibly effective as these skilled riders could cover in days distances that others would travel in weeks. Genghis first introduced this system to the Mongols, but Ögedei Khan greatly expanded it and used it to stay in constant communication with his generals throughout his ever-increasing empire. And speaking of generals, Ögedei used many of the military commanders who had already proven their worth to his father, and chief among them was Subutai, who was, without a shadow of a doubt, one of the greatest military strategists in history. And shameless plug incoming, if you don't believe us, you can check out the bio we did on him a few years back, hosted by my predecessor, the esteemed Simon Whistler. Of course, surrounded by a powerful and determined enemy with no reinforcements on the way, the siege of Kaifeng could only end one way for the Qin Dynasty. It took over a year, but famine and disease ultimately forced the Chinese to either surrender or face a slow, agonizing death behind their impregnable city walls. The Qin Emperor Aizhang managed to escape Kaifeng and fled to the city of Kaizhou, leaving the defense of the capital in the hands of a general named Choi Liu. The general, however, knew when he was staring defeat right in the face, so he surrendered to the invading army. Afterward, with the help of the Song Dynasty, who was still thirsting for revenge against the Qin state, the Mongol forces laid siege to Kaizhou next. There was nowhere else to run this time. This was the last stand. Following a much shorter siege, Subutai breached the walls of the city and Emperor Aizhang committed suicide to avoid being captured. Like many others who bore witness to the wrath of Khan, the Qin Dynasty had fallen, and its lands were divided between the Mongols and the Song Dynasty. For now. While part of Ögedei's army was busy with the Qin Dynasty, he sent another contingent to deal with another one of his father's lingering conflicts, that against the Khwarezmian Empire. Even for a conqueror as ferocious and bloodthirsty as Genghis Khan, his campaign against Khwarezmia had been particularly gruesome, laying complete waste to some of the biggest cities inside the empire and killing all of the inhabitants. At the beginning of the 13th century, Khwarezmia was the dominant force in Central Asia, but it took Genghis just 2 years to completely subdue it. The Khwarezmian leader at the time, Shah Muhammad II, fled his kingdom and died circa 1220 somewhere near the Caspian Sea. His eldest son and heir, Jalal al-Din, tried to mount a comeback with less than stellar results. However, following Genghis's death, al-Din did manage to score a victory at Damgan against another one of Ögedei's trusted generals, Chormakhan. However, all this did was prolong the inevitable. This was a minor setback for Ogadeay Khan, which showed him that he simply needed to throw more men at the problem until it went away. So he did. Ögedei reinforced Chormakhan with a new army of 30,000 to 50,000 soldiers and let him loose upon the Middle East. With fresh forces, the general added substantially to the already gargantuan Mongol Empire. He didn't even go after Jalal al-Din first. He knew that al-Din was already struggling to establish a foothold in the area and was fighting with the Ayyubid dynasty to maintain control over his little kingdom. Whenever Chormakhan was ready, the last Khwarezmian Shah would be ripe for the picking. Until then, though, the Mongol general focused his attention on Persia and Khorasan, two regions that had long been supporters of the Khwarezmian Empire. As expected, the Mongol fury had been swift and merciless, and in just 1 year they were both under Ögedei's control, with just the fortified city of Isfahan acting as the lone holdout. But once again, having an overwhelming numbers advantage meant that the Mongol general could simply leave a contingent of his army to lay siege on the stronghold and just keep going with the rest of his campaign. He knew that maybe not today or tomorrow, but eventually the city would either surrender or starve. As the last act of a desperate man, Jalal al-Din tried to appeal to the men who were once his enemies, the Ayyubid dynasty, the Seljuk Turks, and the Abbasid Caliphate. His sales pitch was basically, help me to defeat the Mongols now, or otherwise the same thing will happen to you. These were indeed prophetic words, but nobody heeded them. The Mongols were a new and uncertain threat, but Khwarezmania had been a thorn in their side for a long time, and they were actually glad to finally see them gone. No aid was forthcoming. As Chormakhan predicted, when it finally came time for him to deal with the holdout of Khwarezmian forces in 1231, they fell with little resistance. As far as Jalal al-Din was concerned, he retreated into the mountains and was ostensibly killed by bandits that same year. The mission was done, but the Mongols were not the kind to pack up and go home when they still had a perfectly good army and lands left to plunder. Therefore, Chormakhan traveled into the southern Caucasus, where he spent the next several years fighting with Georgia and Armenia, bringing them under the Mongol banner. Since his generals seemed to have the fighting well in hand, Ögedei Khan was free to dedicate himself to some of the more mundane matters of running an empire, trade, taxes, and the like. One of his most trusted advisors, Yelu Chitsai, is actually credited with developing most of the administrative policies enacted during Ögedei's reign. Specifically, Chitsai convinced Ögedei that, in the long run, it was better to tax the people he had conquered instead of simply taking whatever he wanted and killing those who tried to oppose him. To that end, Ögedei divided his massive empire into smaller administrative divisions and installed regional governors called Durakachi to oversee them and make sure that the tax money made its way to the big boss. Furthermore, Ögedei continued to develop another idea originally introduced by his father, that of a state-partnered merchant association called the Ortakh. Even a warmongering empire like the Mongols still recognized the value of a healthy trade network, so they instituted a system that not only protected, but even encouraged the merchants under their watch. Basically, merchants who were a part of the Orta were given passports that allowed them to travel safely along the Silk Road and even use the relay stations from the Yam network. They were given tax breaks and later on even had access to low-interest loans. All of this was well and good. The money was starting to flow, but where was it going exactly? The nomadic Mongols spent most of their time in camps, living in portable tents called yurts. If Ögedei was planning on lugging around his empire's entire treasury with him, he was going to need the world's largest piggy bank. Wisely, he concluded that you cannot run one of the grandest empires in history out of a traveling tent. You needed a permanent capital to act as your center of power. So instead, Ögedei did something uncharacteristic of the Mongols. He built a city, Karakorum. Well, technically it was Genghis who founded Karakorum circa 1220, but it was only a yurt town in his day, one of several found on the nomadic route that the Great Khan used to travel throughout his empire. It was Ogadeay Khan who decided to transform Karakorum into a proper city by adding fixed housing, temples, walls, gates, and even a palace. In just a few decades, Karakorum became one of the great seats of power in all of Asia. Modern archaeologists even came up with a new term to describe cities like Karakorum, implanted urbanization, because every builder, craftsman, and artisan, and every single piece of material used to construct it, everything except for the mud used in bricks, was forcefully brought in from someplace else. Now that Ögedei had put his fiscal and administrative affairs in order, he could go back to what he loved best: unpitying, brutal conquest. Fortunately for him, and unfortunately for everyone else, there were still places in Asia that were not under the Mongol yoke just yet. First up was Korea, or Koryo as the kingdom was known back then. It was the same old song and dance. In 1231, Ögedei commanded one of his generals to round up an army and go conquer Korea for him, like it was a shiny new toy he wanted to play with or something. He received aid from a powerful Koryo commander named Hang Bahwan, who decided he wanted to be on the winning team and swap jerseys before the start of the game. Despite one moment of glory during the siege of Kuju, Koryo was no match for the Mongol might, and the capital of Kaesong fell later that same year, forcing them to sue for peace and become a vassal. With Koryo subdued, the Mongol Empire included almost all of East Asia, with just one exception, the Song Empire, which still controlled a large chunk of eastern China. The Song Dynasty were the ones who helped the Mongols conquer the Qin state. But such actions mattered little in the pursuit of glory for the horde. So in 1235, the Mongols crossed into Song territory and launched an invasion, but the latter would not go down without a fight. In fact, it took the Mongol Empire almost half a century to wipe out the Song dynasty, decades after Ögedei Khan was dead. It is possible that the Great Khan could have rushed the process along, but he reserved a giant chunk of his army for another purpose. Ögedei Khan had another target in his sights: Europe. In 1235, the bulk of the Mongol forces started making their way toward Europe. It was all hands on deck for this one, all except Ögedei, who still sat back and kicked his feet up in Karakorum, awaiting news of his latest triumphs. His nephew Batu Khan, or Patan, was nominally in charge of this campaign, although General Subutai developed most of their plans of attack. Their first target was Kievan Rus, the federation that controlled the borderlands between Asia and Europe. The Mongols had already fought and bested Kievan Rus's once under Genghis Khan, but then retreated without any permanent gains. This time they persevered until they subjugated all of the Rus's principalities. Ryazan suffered the worst fate during the invasion. As the first Russian city to be besieged by Mongol forces, Batu wanted to set an example of what happened to those who refused to surrender and pay tribute. He laid siege to Ryazan in December 1237, and although the siege lasted only 5 days, it was absolutely devastating. By this point, the Mongols had developed strong artillery, and a few days of continuous shelling was enough to breach the Russian defenses. Ryazan asked for help, but all the neighboring principalities were looking out for themselves. As the Mongols suspected, the Russian states still did not comprehend the true extent of the danger they were in and were hoping to weather the storm alone. But Ryazan showed everyone that this was not going to happen. Most of the population was put to death, including the entire royal family, while the city itself was burned to the ground. Many other cities fell after Ryazan: Vladimir, Moscow, Suzdal, Rostov, and a dozen others, culminating with the capture of Kiev in December 1240. Russia had fallen, more or less, and a small contingent was left to suppress any lingering opposition, while the bulk of the Mongol horde advanced deeper into Europe. Poland and Hungary felt the brunt of their wrath, although no kingdom in Eastern or Central Europe managed to escape unscathed. Similar to their campaign in Russia, the Mongol army wanted to divide and conquer and used their lightning-quick attacks to prevent the European forces from uniting. That's why Subutai split off a divisionary force of 20,000 soldiers and sent them to stop Poland from reinforcing Hungary. This smaller army was just meant to keep Poland busy, but in fact it destroyed the Polish forces in half a year, culminating with their victory at the Battle of Legnica on April 9, 1241. As an added bonus, King Wenceslas I of Bohemia was about to provide aid, but when he heard of Poland's defeat, he instead chose to retreat and secure as many reinforcements for himself as he could, worried about his own kingdom. It always worked in the Mongols' favor when their opponents chose to look out for number one instead of banding together, and all signs pointed towards Hungary falling like the rest. By early 1242, the horde had already scored several decisive victories, including the Battle of the Soyo River. The kingdom had been devastated and left at the mercy of the Mongol Empire. It seemed like there was no stopping them, and that all of Europe was theirs for the taking. But then, something happened. In the spring of 1242, the Mongols withdrew from Europe. They had all the advantages they could want, and yet they simply left. What could have happened to make them all give up on their plans for European domination? It turns out they had received word that Ögedei was dead. The great Khan had died the previous year on December 11, 1241, at the age of 56. The exact cause of death is uncertain, although it was most likely brought on by Ögedei's unquenchable thirst for booze. Either that or he was poisoned. We can never truly rule out poison, can we? As it happened when Genghis died, a Kurultai was convened and all of his close blood relatives had to attend to sort out the issue of deciding the next Khagan. Initially, Ögedei wanted his son Kochu to be his heir, but he died while fighting the Song dynasty. Then Ögedei appointed Kochu's son, Shireman, but it seems this was not a popular move. After all, Ögedei was no Genghis, so his choice was seen more as a suggestion rather than a final decision, a suggestion that was promptly ignored. Until the new Great Khan was elected, Ögedei's wife, Torjin, acted as regent, and she wanted her son with Ögedei, Gayuk, to become the new Khagan. Others wanted Monke, the oldest son of Tothlui, to lead them. It was a tense situation that needed 5 years to get resolved and caused instability to the empire, which until that point seemed unstoppable. It wasn't until Kublai Khan assumed leadership a couple decades later that he managed to get the Mongols back on track toward world domination. And if you want to see how that turned out, we have a bio on Kublai ready and waiting for you. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment a historical figure we haven't covered yet, subscribe, ring that bell, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical figures. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time.